Hey everyone. I never thought I'd be posting something like this, but I really need to get it off my chest and maybe even warn some of you. So, my dad, where do I even begin? To everyone in our town, he was basically a saint. A self-made success story. He owned the biggest real estate company for miles, his face was always in the local paper for some charity event or another, and he had this way of talking that could make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. He was Mr. Townsend, the guy who remembered your kids' names and always tipped generously at the diner. Growing up, I idolized him. He coached my little league team, never missed a school play, and taught me how to change a tire. Our relationship was perfect. Or so I thought. The first sign that something was off was really subtle. It started about a year ago. He became more distant, more preoccupied. Our weekly fishing trips started getting cancelled for urgent business meetings. When I'd call him, his answers were short, and he always seemed irritated, like I was bothering him. I wrote it off as stress. Running a big company is hard, right? I figured he was just tired. But the excuses started piling up, and the kind, attentive dad I knew began to feel like a stranger who just lived in my father's house. I had no idea that this was just the very beginning, and the truth behind his disappearing acts was so much darker than I could have ever imagined. The change was so gradual I almost talked myself out of noticing it. It wasn't just the cancelled plans. It was the little things. He'd get this far-off look in his eyes during dinner, his phone buzzing constantly on the table. He'd always flip it over quickly, a little too quickly. Mom noticed it too, but she'd just sigh and say, "Your father is under a lot of pressure, honey. We have to be supportive." I wanted to be, but it felt like the man I knew was being slowly replaced by a quieter, colder version. Then, about 6 months ago, I was at his office after hours to drop off some paperwork my mom had asked me to bring. His assistant had already left, and the place was dead quiet. I was about to just leave the folder on her desk when I noticed the door to his private office was slightly ajar. He was always so meticulous about keeping it locked. A part of me knew I shouldn't, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The room smelled like his expensive cologne and old leather, just like always. I placed the folder on his desk and was about to leave when my elbow knocked a small, framed photo of us from my 10th birthday off the corner of his desk. It clattered to the floor, the glass in the frame cracking. I felt terrible. I bent down to pick it up, and that's when I saw it. Tucked underneath the bottom drawer of his desk was a plain, tan folder. It was shoved way back, like it wasn't meant to be found. The folder for the dropped-off papers was now empty in my hand. Without even really thinking, I slid the hidden folder out and opened it. My heart just started pounding. It was filled with financial statements for shell companies I'd never heard of, and pages of complex transfer logs. None of it made immediate sense, but at the top of one page, circled in red pen, were 3 words that made my blood run cold. Offshore Holdings Confidential. This wasn't just stress. This was a secret. I stood there in his office, frozen, the tan folder feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. My eyes scanned the pages, not fully comprehending the legal and financial jargon, but understanding enough. There were lists of properties I knew our company didn't own, transactions with amounts that made my head spin, and what looked like falsified inspection reports for a bunch of old buildings on the west side of town. One name, Elmsworth Properties, kept popping up. I'd heard Dad mention it in passing, always calling it a troublesome but minor investment. This looked anything but minor. I heard the elevator ding down the hall. Panic shot through me. I fumbled, shoving the folder back into its hiding spot, grabbing the broken photo frame, and practically sprinted out of the office. I was back in the main lobby, pretending to look at a painting on the wall, when my dad walked in. "What are you doing here, son?" he asked, his tone not warm, just curious. And maybe a little annoyed. "Just dropping off that stuff Mom wanted you to have," I said, my voice thankfully steady. I held up the broken frame. "Sorry I knocked this over." I'll get it reglazed. He waved a dismissive hand, not even looking at the picture of us. Don't worry about it. It's just a thing. I've got a conference call in 5. You should head home. And just like that, he walked into his office and closed the door. I was dismissed. Standing there, holding the cracked photo of a happier time, I knew. The man on the other side of that door was not the man in the picture. And I had to find out why. I couldn't stop thinking about that folder. It consumed me. I started paying closer attention, listening in on his phone calls when I could. He'd use phrases like creative accounting and aggressive asset management. He'd laugh with someone on the other end about how the town council eats out of my hand. It made me feel sick. The breaking point came a few weeks later. Dad asked me to help him troubleshoot his home office computer. He said it was running slow. He needed to take a call and left me alone with it. As I was closing some unnecessary programs, a chat window popped up on the screen. It was minimized, but the preview text was visible. The other person's username was Elmsworth_admin. The message read, "The environmental survey for the Linden ST project is a problem. The groundwater test came back hot. We need to bury it. Permanently." My blood went cold. Hot could only mean one thing: contamination. They were going to build on toxic land and hide the report. I quickly clicked on the chat history. It was a treasure trove of corruption, discussions about bribing local officials, falsifying safety records for old apartment buildings he owned, and siphoning money from his own charity foundation. This wasn't just a few shady deals, it was a whole secret life. I felt like I was going to be sick. I closed everything just as he came back into the room, not suspecting a thing. I had the evidence. Now I needed the truth. I spent the next few days in a complete daze. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time I looked at my dad, this pillar of the community, this man who shook hands with the mayor and gave speeches at Rotary Club lunches, all I could see was the liar from those chat logs. I had to confront him. I couldn't just sit on this. I decided to do it at his house, in his study, a place that always felt safe. I asked if we could talk, that it was important. He agreed, but he was clearly distracted, typing on his phone. He finally looked up and said, "All right, what's so urgent? Make it quick, I've got a dinner with the planning commissioner in an hour." "No. How are you, son?" No concern in his voice. Just impatience. It was that indifference that finally gave me the courage to speak. I took a deep breath and just said it. "I know about Elmsworth Properties. I know about the falsified reports, the offshore accounts, and the contaminated land on Linden Street. The silence that followed was so thick you could choke on it." His face went through a series of transformations so fast it was almost comical. First, there was shock, his eyes wide. Then, a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. But finally, his features settled into a mask of cold, calculated calm. He slowly placed his phone on the desk, screen down. "I don't know what you think you've found, or what nonsense you've been listening to," he began, his voice dangerously low and even. "But you are a child meddling in very adult, very complex business matters you couldn't possibly understand. It's not complicated, Dad," I shot back, my voice cracking. "It's illegal. You're hiding a toxic waste report. You're stealing from your own charity." He sighed, a long, weary sound, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "You have such a simplistic view of the world. Do you think this town runs on goodness and light? Everything I've done, every single difficult decision, has been to build something for this family. For you. That charity? It's a tax write-off that also happens to make us look good. It's a tool. The Linden Street project? That land will be worth millions. A minor environmental issue is a small price to pay for progress." He leaned forward, his eyes hardening. "This is how the real world works. You make tough choices. You play the game. And you," he pointed a finger at me, "need to learn to keep your mouth shut and fall in line. This conversation is over. You will forget everything you think you know. Do you understand me? He wasn't denying it. He was justifying it. And in that moment, any last shred of hope I had that this was all some horrible misunderstanding evaporated into thin air. I just stared at him. I couldn't even form words. The man standing in front of me wasn't my father. He was a stranger who wore his face. For this family? I finally whispered, my voice trembling. You're poisoning the town we live in for money. You're lying to everyone, including Mom and me. How is that for us? He didn't even flinch. Your mother is happy not knowing the details. And you will be too, if you're smart. This self-righteous anger is juvenile. Now I have a dinner to get to. We're done here. He picked up his phone and car keys, walking out of the study without a backward glance. I heard the front door close a moment later. I stood alone in his fancy study, surrounded by awards and photos of him shaking hands with important people. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The anger was there, a hot, sharp knot in my chest, but it was instantly drowned out by this overwhelming, crushing sadness. It felt like a death. The dad I thought I had was gone, and had been for a long time. I cried there, in his chair, for the man I missed and for the truth that had just shattered my entire world. The next few weeks were the darkest of my life. I walked around like a ghost. I couldn't talk to my mom about it. He was right, she was blissfully unaware, happy in her world of garden clubs and charity luncheons. Telling her would destroy her. I felt completely and utterly alone. The anger and sadness churned inside me until they fused into something else, a cold, hard resolution. He thought I was a child who would fall in line. He thought his money and power could silence the truth. He thought he could just dismiss me and my morals as juvenile. He was wrong. I couldn't just move on. I couldn't keep my mouth shut and fall in line. Not after what I'd seen. Not after how he'd spoken to me. His confession wasn't an apology. It was a boast. He was proud of what he'd built, no matter how corrupt its foundation. If he wouldn't face consequences, then I would have to make sure he did. It wasn't just about revenge for lying to me. It was for every person in this town he was deceiving and endangering. The plan started forming in my mind, piece by terrible piece. It was drastic. It would burn our entire lives to the ground. But he left me with no other choice. I became a ghost in my own life, but I was working constantly. I needed irrefutable proof, something so public and so damning that he couldn't lie, bully, or bribe his way out of it. I remembered the company's annual Founders' Day celebration was coming up. It was the biggest event of the year for his business. The whole town would be there, employees, clients, the mayor, the city council, local news reporters, everyone. My dad would always give a big speech, patting himself on the back for his community values and ethical leadership. The hypocrisy made me feel physically ill. But it also presented the perfect opportunity. It was the ultimate stage. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just leak documents to a reporter. He'd squash the story. It had to be a moment he couldn't control. It had to come from me, his son, in front of everyone he had spent a lifetime fooling. I spent days in the library on a public computer, compiling everything. I printed out copies of the most damning chat logs, the environmental report he was burying, and the financial transfers. I made a USB drive with digital copies of everything. My hands shook the entire time. I was terrified. But the image of his cold, dismissive face in his study kept me going. He thought this was all a game. I was about to change the rules. The night of the Founders' Day celebration arrived. The town hall was decked out in my dad's company colors. There was a huge banner with his face on it that read, "Visionary leader and pillar of the community." I felt nauseous. I wore a suit, a forced smile on my face, and I carried a simple manila envelope. Inside were the copies I'd made. The USB drive was in my pocket. I mingled, making small talk with people who told me how proud I must be of my father. I just nodded, my heart hammering against my ribs. I saw my dad holding court at the center of the room, laughing, clapping people on the back, the picture of generosity and success. He caught my eye and gave me a faint, smug nod, as if to say, "See? This is how it's done." Finally, it was time for his speech. He took the podium to thunderous applause. He talked about humility, hard work, and giving back to the town that had given him so much. The lies flowed so smoothly, so effortlessly. I stood at the back of the room, my hand clenched around the envelope. This was it. He was finishing up, thanking everyone for coming. The crowd began to applaud. He stepped back from the microphone, beaming. And that's when I started walking forward. The applause was starting to die down as I made my way through the crowd. People smiled at me, probably thinking I was going up to give my dad a hug or something. I saw his smile tighten just a fraction, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He hadn't planned for this. I didn't break my stride. I walked right past him and stepped up to the podium. The microphone was still on. I could hear my own breathing amplified in the sudden quiet of the room. A few people chuckled, thinking it was part of the show. I looked out at hundreds of expectant, smiling faces, our friends, our neighbors. My mouth was dry as dust. "I'm sorry to interrupt the celebration," I began, my voice shaky but clear through the speakers. "But there's something everyone here needs to hear." I held up the manila envelope. My dad was frozen behind me, but I could feel his stare burning into the back of my head. I heard him take a sharp breath. This was the point of no return. I ripped the envelope open. "My father has just given a beautiful speech about integrity and community," I said, my voice growing stronger, fueled by a mix of terror and conviction. "But it's all a lie." A wave of confused murmurs swept through the crowd. I pulled out the first sheet of paper. "I have here the environmental report for the Linden Street project that his company, through a shell corporation called Elmsworth Properties, intentionally buried. The groundwater is contaminated with industrial chemicals." He knew, and he planned to build homes there anyway. The murmurs turned into gasps. I didn't stop. I held up printouts of the chat logs. And here are conversations about bribing officials, falsifying safety records for the low-income apartment buildings he owns, and siphoning money from the Townsend Family Charity Foundation into offshore accounts. I turned and looked directly at my father. His face was a mask of pure, white-hot rage and horror. He took a step toward me, but it was too late. The truth was out. This man isn't a pillar of the community. He's its biggest predator. I tossed the papers into the air, letting them flutter down over the front rows. I pulled the USB drive from my pocket and held it up. "And everything I've just said is backed up right here. The local news has a copy. The State Attorney General's office has a copy." The room erupted into chaos. The silence that followed was absolute for about 2 seconds, and then the room exploded. Voices shouted questions. Camera phones flashed. My dad stood completely still, his jaw clenched so tight I thought it might break. The look he gave me wasn't just anger, it was a promise of utter annihilation. He finally lunged for the podium, grabbing for the microphone. "This is a ridiculous stunt," he boomed, his voice shaking with fury. "My son is clearly unwell. He's been under a great deal of personal stress and is making outrageous, baseless accusations." But no one was listening anymore. People were scrambling for the falling papers, reporters were fighting their way toward the front, and the mayor was being ushered out a side door by aides. The perfect facade he had spent decades building cracked and then shattered into a million pieces in under 3 minutes. I just stood there, watching him unravel. I felt empty, drained, but I didn't feel regret. He made his choices. I just made sure everyone else knew about them. I turned and walked off the stage, through the chaotic crowd, and out into the cool night air. I could already hear the first sirens in the distance. In the days that followed, my world completely fell apart, just as I knew it would. My father was arrested. The news cycles were brutal. My mom was devastated. She had to face the dual horror of her husband's crimes and her son's public betrayal. We cried together for hours. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, telling her everything, showing her the proof. She ultimately understood why I did it, but our family was irrevocably broken. I moved out, got a small apartment, and started seeing a therapist. The guilt was overwhelming at times. I had nuked my own life from orbit. But every time I started to doubt myself, I'd remember the chat logs about the toxic land, or the cold way he justified it all to me. I'd think about the families who could have gotten sick living in those homes. This wasn't just about my broken relationship with my dad, it was about preventing real, tangible harm. The town is reeling. Investigations are everywhere. It turns out my dad had his fingers in a lot of pies, and a lot of people who seemed clean might not be. It's a mess. But it's a mess that needed to be made. The truth, no matter how ugly, is always better than a beautiful lie. So, that's my story. I don't have a perfect, happy ending to offer. My family is fractured, my last name is mud in this town, and I'm in therapy dealing with the fallout of exposing my own father. But I can sleep at night. I look in the mirror and I see someone who, when pushed into an impossible corner, chose what was right over what was easy. If you're in a situation anywhere close to this, my advice is this: trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Get proof. Solid, undeniable proof. And be prepared for the cost. Standing up for the truth, especially against someone you love, will cost you everything. It's a lonely path. But living with the knowledge that you stayed silent while someone caused harm? That cost you your soul. There's no fixing a relationship built on a foundation of lies. Sometimes, the only way to heal is to tear it all down and hope that something better, something honest, can be built from the rubble. It's a terrible, painful process. But it's necessary. And you're not alone. Thanks for listening.